I would like to ask Vika Kirchenbauer, who I will just, would you mind if I just introduce you a tiny bit so that people who don't know your work can get an idea? The talk is called on essayist approaches in writing, performance, and video making. So that there's very thorough three areas that are going to be reflected upon. She will focus on 4 of her video works that have each tried out a different strategy. One of them being the 3D video installation You Are Boring, made in 2015. I'm always going back to 19 something. It's 2015. And it works with a cast of queer performance to read experiential consumption of marginalized bodies within art institutions to the rise of experience economy. This will be followed by a discussion on Untitled Sequence of Gaps, made in 2020, which will be followed by the Capacity for Adequate Anger, 2021. And for the first time, she has agreed to talk about compassion and inconvenience, which I think is an extensive project to date, as she suggested, nearing to completion, working on the sound environment, as far as I remember. And it is really about the interconnectedness with ideas from liberalism and the Scottish Enlightenment, as well as with British colonialism. Her work has always effectively been a subject of formation. She examines violence as it attaches to different forms of visibility and invisibility, and considers the ways in which subjects are implicated in and situated within institutional power structures. Is that, do you think, enough for you to go on? Vika, I'll leave it to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, dear Shaheen, for your warm invitation and your so generously formulated introduction. I'm really glad to be here this evening and to hear Michelle's talk, and then I'm looking forward to a conversation between all of us in this town hall format that Jane suggested. I will just say a couple of words before I go into my presentation. I will be, as Shaheen already mentioned, I'll be talking about 4 video works, and I'll also be talking about essay writing and different kind of strategies of trying things out with language in writing and performance and video making. But since the essays are largely online and the videos aren't, I'll put a bit more emphasis on the videos, that some of them are informed by performance or video performances, because I have to explain a bit more about them, since they are not so easily accessible outside of exhibitions and screenings. We will be watching 2 short excerpts from You Are Boring, which is a 3D video installation from 2015. We'll be watching them as short excerpts in 2D, because we cannot show 3D online. But yeah, thanks also for the technical assistance, and I think this would be a good moment to have a look at the 2 excerpts. Thank you.
As you might have noticed, I'm making certain assumptions about you. And they might to some extent be my fantasy, but I've taken great efforts to get to know you and to be able to offer just exactly what you need. I've been to spaces like this before, so many times. Who you are might be my fantasy, but it's nothing I imagine. I know you, and you know that. You are cultured but stiff, sexually liberated, yet somewhat deeply ashamed. So let me help you.
We're totally unique, so being with us will not only be like the craziest thing you've ever done, it will also be very easy for you to do stuff that you couldn't even imagine. like fucking that exotic asshole that is actually a cunt, or borrowing a dick from someone on whose tits you can come with it. I mean, who wouldn't want to fuck a work of conceptual art? Abstraction become flesh. I mean, wow.
Thank you. And before I start the presentation, there's one more thing that I remembered, which I wanted to say is that as I go through these kind of like different approaches in different works, I just want to stress beforehand that the way they played out, or how these strategies were decided upon, largely depended on the economic circumstances usually. So if a work is performance-based, usually that means that there was money to do it, and if it's closer to an essay film in its form, it usually means there was just a lot less of a budget, and there was no money to involve many other people. So just to give that as a short note. I'll start my presentation now, which hopefully you'll be seeing in a second. Let me know if you don't see this full screen now. Seems to be going well. Okay. So You're Boring is a 3D video installation from 2015. It's about 13.5 minutes long. And it works with a cast of queer performers, Nadia Bice, Misty, Lauren John Joseph, and Max Jöran, to read the experiential consumption of marginalized bodies within art institutions through the rise of the experience economy. Over the last 2 decades, labor in the new economy has become increasingly shaped under the proclaimed next economical step after the emergence of the service industry. The experience economy, as introduced by Joseph Pine and James Gilmore in their book with the same title, first published in 1999. With the slogan of "Work is theater and every business is a stage," their theory suggests that goods will be used as props and services as a stage to create experiences that engage customers, or guests as they call them, in an inherently personal and unforgettable way. So they argue that everything will have to be turned into an experience, and if people are not willing to pay for that experience, the experience on offer is not good enough. And basically people will be wanting to pay money for something that they foresee they foresee liking, remembering. So throughout the book, they put forward many ideas for possible experiences to be developed. And as part of the work in its introduction, after the audience is directly addressed and welcomed, we hear in voiceover some of these experiences that I turned into a list that I found in the book. And I'm just going to read some of them because I find them funny. It's the pumping experience, the appliance delivering experience, the soap dispensing experience, the sleeping experience, the briefcasing experience, the waste basketing experience, the mask taping experience, the drinking experience. And this image that we're seeing now is what we're seeing as we hear this voiceover, but it's read by Lauren John Joseph in the work. So when I did this research about 10 years ago, which I started working on maybe in 2013, when I was working on Please Relax Now, a video performance, where I as a performer engage the audience. Around 10 years ago, the experiential turn within museums and exhibition spaces was already becoming apparent to quite many people. And that's because events started to become more important within art institutions. It was increasingly expected for exhibitions to be activated. So the exhibition couldn't just stand there, something had to happen, it had to be put to life, so to speak. It couldn't just rest. It couldn't just be there. And as was noticeable, difference was included in museums and biennials disproportionately often as part of audience engaging, durational, multi-performer performance art, often showing queer bodies, for instance. And so the question I was asking myself, or the questions I was asking myself were, how are artists, in addition to museum and gallery personnel, becoming actors and providers of experiences? And in particular, what does this mean in regard to the physical and mediated presence of marginalized bodies within art institutions? I became interested in the term experience in relation to the representation of difference, especially in contrast to the concept of the gaze. I thought the term experience offered a more fitting, less sensorially reductive way to consider power dynamics within exhibition spaces. And I came to think of such experiences as staged encounters that, for the unmarked visitor, give a forum to the fantasy of crawling into someone else's skin without the risk of getting stuck in it. You Are Boring in that sense was an attempt at subverting and problematizing these modes of consuming and being consumed. And we used the kind of a stereoscopic 3D technology. So when it's installed, the bodies kind of come closer to the spectator than comfortable. They appear almost like holograms in space and are not just tied to the flat screen, but like become 3D, become three-dimensional in space. What resonated particularly in this strange book of Pine and Gilmore's was their concept of an insistence on a differentiation between offstage work and onstage work. So, for instance, what they mean by this is that when on stage, the worker is performing for others. So, for instance, like in open kitchens, they don't just cook; they provide an experience. Someone is watching and experiencing and smelling how someone is preparing the food. They're not just doing that; they're performing it. Or in hospitals, they suggested that there should be off-stage corridors and on-stage corridors. So in on-stage corridors, people working at the hospital would meet patients, would see their relatives or whoever's visiting them. And in these on-stage corridors, hospital personnel shouldn't be talking about death or unpleasant things. They should do this as part of the off-stage only. And as I was talking to queer performer friends, those who I ended up working with, we had to kind of independently, because I was organizing a lot of events back then, already been talking about the differences between experiencing, or like between performing on stage and then being within an off stage, kind of going home, just being in life, when maybe the same people who enjoy something when it's presented on stage struggle being around that difference when it's closer, when it's off stage. And so we met a few months before shooting, and I had prepared maybe half of the script, and then we were looking at text together and talking about different experiences of performing for the experience of others in concerts, readings, theater, sex work, many experiences that the different performers brought. And we were thinking a lot about like how that difference is then kind of like marketed in some way, or like becomes consumable, as long as it is a set kind of circumstance that can give people an experience that they might otherwise not have. So we're critically engaging with that and trying to see how we could subvert that, how we could counter kind of this unidirectional experiencing and open up different spaces through performance and video. And so after then working on these issues for a while, I condensed them in an essay called Feeling Difference from 2019. And I related some of these ideas further also to the commodified experiences as part of Airbnb's experiences program, or thinking about changing temporalities as they happen via social media and what that does to art events and the liveness and nowness of these events as they're extended through social media, and how the moving image has to be rethought as mode of communication and not so much as a form of archiving, perhaps. And so, yeah, I would say that maybe like these performative propositions that we worked on together before we turned them into a video also helped conceive a text that works quite differently, and it's a totally different way of writing that I find quite interesting, that this kind of performative essayism that relies a lot more on collage and different voices speaking in different registers, but always in a way that it can be digested right away, more or less. I think like there's a bit of overload, but compared to a written text, it's a different form of working with language and trying out ideas. And some of these ideas I took up then later. I'm jumping to a different work from 2020, Untitled Sequence of Gaps, that's 12.5 minutes long. It kind of looks at some of these thoughts around experience and vision and their differences in quite a different context and form. And form is a first-person essay film led by a voiceover that I read and that I wrote. And it's an autobiographical work on trauma-related memory loss. And in it, I think about questions of visibility and invisibility and the relationship between violence, trauma, memory, and representation. I do that by reflecting on light outside the visible spectrum, on what is felt but not seen, or at least not seen from all perspectives. So, kind of in a condensed way, it's a video work on memories that are inaccessible and about colors that cannot be seen by the human eye, which makes the work, in a way, a work about the limitations of the medium of the moving image. And it uses different imaging techniques, like images shot under ultraviolet light, images produced with infrared imaging technology, found footage, and so on, to kind of question the impulse of image making and also the impulse of dragging into the frame what resists representation. And the work considers the ways in which violence often works outside the visual and showable, the underlying question being, how can one negotiate in moving images the kinds of violence that sit in gaps, or that are structural and systemic, that don't always have an image? Or perhaps rephrase it, how can one approach these kind of invisible kinds of violence, as well as trauma, which contradict the paradigm of visuality a lot of thoughts and thinking around the moving image rely on. So in the work, there's a lot of gaps, there's a lot of imagelessness, and these imageless bits kind of form the structure. To me, they're the center from which sometimes images emerge, and it works a bit like memory in the sense that it's not linear, it's not constant, it's not chronological. There's a big void, and sometimes things plop up, and it's not always possible to place them. And so I thought it's interesting perhaps to look back at these works, because the strategies used are quite different. So while You Are Boring uses direct address as a strategy and is rather confrontational to the spectator, it uses performance and text collage as an essayistic method. On the other hand, Untitled, while addressing like similar questions to some extent, it also addresses questions of work and class. It has a lot of questions to like subject formation, but its tone is quieter, more personal and poetic. And I think there's a shift where, while You're Boring kind of centers kind of the unmarked spectator. I'm not sure if that's centering is the right word, but it kind of addresses at least that spectator. It might still center others, but it performs an address to someone who's there to consume difference. And I think I found some limitations in that address and in that address. And so Untitled is addresses another kind of spectator, I would say, that it centers a spectator with whom the structures of feeling in the work might resonate more closely, while those with whom there's less resonance, I think there's elements that can be accessed and that can be engaged with, but there are definitely layers that will resonate with those who might not have gone through like kind of like similar experiences or dealing with similar questions, but who kind of like resonate with like a similar kind of effective infrastructure, perhaps, or pattern. And so for the production of the work, when I wrote the funding application, I thought I was going to return to the place in which I grew up after I hadn't been there for over 10 years. And I was going to go there to film an annual witch burning ritual that was happening like 100, 200 meters from the house I grew up in a small village, every year on solstice. And after I got the funding for the project and I was taking first steps to plan a shoot there, I found out that the witch burning ritual had recently been abolished, just a few years before I was interested in going there. Ready is also not the right word. When I had planned to go there. So the witch burning ritual had been abolished, but this is to say that only the burning of the straw witch had been taken out of the festivity and the huge bonfire remained. And that prompted me to think further also about the questions of how violence works outside of the image that can be commonly witnessed, and if the violence is gone just because it cannot be seen anymore. So I ended up working with found footage, which you can see in this image. And in Düsseldorf, at Kunstverein Düsseldorf, it's part of my first institutional solo exhibition that took place in 2021, 2 years ago, and kind of displayed 10 years of my practice, different installations and video works and light installation, and also this carpet installation is quite large, called Playing Field, that is made up of many individual parts that echo some of the colors that Untitled Sequence of Gaps uses, but also questioning with a light installation in another room, where the queerness perhaps exists outside that playing field and outside the visible spectrum, so outside the representable rainbow, so to speak. And this brings me to the next work, the capacity for adequate anger that was produced for the exhibition in Düsseldorf. So like, and it brings together, because the show was like showing, an elevated number of video works from the past 10 years, going back to 2012. The capacity for adequate anger from 2021 kind of brings together two strands of the practice. So the personal and autobiographical explorations of societal power relations, as used in Untitled Sequence of Gaps, for instance, as well as the preoccupation with established routines of experiencing the physical or visual presence of marginalized bodies in exhibition spaces, as it was kind of engaged with, and You Are Boring. And Please Relax Now, for instance. Just come to issues in water. I used the moment of my first institutional kind of retrospective solo exhibition to reflect on matters of social class, as well as class mobility in regard to contemporary art, in a kind of self-reflexive and self-implicating way. The societal structure in which different kinds of cultural practices are hierarchically ordered presupposes and produces notions of class mobility that I think are predicated on distance. Talking about class, for an artist socialized within a class, socially considered lower, to become legitimized and visible within the artistic field, it is a prerequisite that they first establish significant distance to their class origins by obtaining distinctive educational and cultural capital. Once legitimized, included, and elevated onto the platform on which the field of art gives visibility, the artist then gains an outlook from a class position quite distanced and distinguished from the one originally inhabited. So basically, like it's a precondition to leave, or to be able to leave a class background, to be on that elevated form. And even if a return is possible, it's important, like class mobility, like imagines movement. It imagines not being stuck, and that not being stuck, that having choice, being able to go back and leave again, as in direct opposition to how many working class people experience the scope of their decision or lack thereof. So capacity in many ways is a work about these temporal, social, political, and geographical forms of distance. And again is led by a voiceover read by me. Photographs taken on the journey to the place in which I grew up are combined with scans of childhood drawings, CD booklets, family photos, and basketball trading cards, as well as reframed scenes from a feminist and communist Japanese anime series from the 1970s called The Rose of Versailles by Ryoko Ikeda, outlining the lives of Marie Antoinette. The Rose of Versailles was based on Austrian author Stefan Zweig's book, Marie Antoinette, Portrait of an Average Woman, and played on German television in the 90s. The series' main character was Lady Oscar, a fictitious and gender-ambiguous guardsperson, who is the guardsperson of Marie Antoinette, and who was presented as a girl who was raised as a boy because her father wanted a boy. And I use, this is a point of reference in terms of like queer subtexts or glimpses on TV or queer readings and disidentifications. And what is brought up in the anime series, but also in Zweig's book. And what I was particularly interested in is how Marie Antoinette was fascinated with an idea of the simple life, which materialized when she had a hamlet built nearby her Trianon castle. And to populate the village, the court casted peasants to act as peasants for the queen to look at. So the queen was supposed to be in a castle and look at a small village where former peasants were producing milk and conducting agricultural tasks and so on. But they had to be like physically strong and look like peasants, but also be physically pleasant to look at. And in the context of my first institutional solo show, I was interested in the two positions this offers. The privileged position of looking at the peasant, but also the position of the perhaps former peasant performing as peasant. In many ways, these two positions, and I think that's what the work alludes to, are simultaneously occupied if someone ends up exhibiting in art institutions as a representative or marked as a representative of a class reality from outside the art field's own class environment, so to speak. And as the show was being installed in this house, I looked at the workers cleaning windows, cutting and laying my carpet that I had designed, building walls, installing the exhibition, and wondering if that's not something that I should be doing, or that would have that was supposed to be my path, and in a sense felt like Marie Antoinette, looking at someone's work that just happens because I wanted it to happen. The role of a boss, so to speak, or someone who creates labor, or who kind of like makes other people work. So at the same time, as I was like looking at that, it's more complicated thinking also about the other decisions, because the content of some of the works that were exhibited also revisit different class realities that I've experienced, and talk about work and experiences of labor and how that forms subjectivity within a class-based society. And by showing these works, it also makes these realities accessible to the gaze or the experience of an art, or the experiencing of an art audience, who may oftentimes not necessarily share a similar background. So those were kind of like the two simultaneous positions that I was interested in. And if they're not the most extreme positions, of course, and they're not absolute polar opposites, but they're two simultaneous positions that I think like create a certain kind of like a particular internal split when included into a space that like via like some kind of difference, if it's gendered or classed or etc. And some of these thoughts on visibility in relation to trauma, violence, labor, class, also thoughts about the art system, the sexual violence within the structures of contemporary art, and the way they prevail, and a lot of these thoughts about visibility and justice, injustice, opacity, and transparency, I then kind of put together again in an essay called On Violence and Visibility that I wrote last year as an essay for my first monograph that was published by Moose Publishing. and unites kind of these 10 years of my practice, where it includes scripts and essays and texts by two other thinkers, Eva Majewska and Leroy Kahn, as well as an introduction by the editors, Anja Hauser, Victor Neumann, and Eva Birkenstock. And yeah, so the essay on violence and visibility that was released last year in the book, I also put on my website a couple of weeks ago, if anyone's interested. And these questions around arts, institutional structures, inclusion across difference, the violence in structures, and especially also artists' implication in these violent structures, then formed the starting point for my current project that I've been working on for like a year and a half, nearly 2 years now, called Compassion and Inconvenience. It is nearing completion, and so far it's the most extensive and most research-intensive project that I've worked on. Formally, it combines methods of performative essayism as explored in You Are Boring with some of the strategies used in Untitled Sequence of Gaps and the capacity for adequate anger. There's, however, in this work no voiceover, but only written text, in addition to text performed by performers. Compassion and Inconvenience looks at the first public exhibitions of contemporary art in mid-18th century London, as well as the episodes and circumstances leading up to them. And it's based, as I mentioned, on extensive archival research. The work traces prevailing conceptions of art to their ideological and material interconnectedness with ideas from liberalism and the Scottish Enlightenment, as well as with British colonialism. And so, yeah, it reflects a lot on how kind of the emergence of the concept of taste was preconditional to forms of violence and not in opposition, while it is often presumed that while these people had such fine taste, how could they be so cruel? I follow the argument that those are not in opposition, but taste and kind of the hierarchization of taste and making others tasteless by elevating oneself is the precondition of cruelty. And so in the work, the Foundling Hospital in London, which is an oft overlooked care facility for deserted young children, is in the work set as the genesis for the establishment of European art institutions, in which private economic and colonial interests intersect with notions of benevolence and the pursuit of refinement. The Foundling Hospital was established by Thomas Coram after many years of petitioning the king for a royal charter. And Coram himself was active as a businessman in the American colonies before he retired to England, and then kind of dedicated the rest of his life to his philanthropic energies, and what we see now as part of a petition to King George, where Horace Coram, gentleman, on behalf of great number of helpless infants daily exposed to destruction, petitions the king to allow kind of the organization and implementation of a Foundling Hospital. And that is then performed in the video work Compassion and Inconvenience. Here we see Olympia Bukakis. And what I find interesting in these petitions is that the argument of saving lives was not understood as sufficient. So child mortality rate at the time was at about 75%. So 3 in 4 children died before they were 5. But the case that is repeatedly made in these petitions is that it would not only save these royal subjects, or like the majesty's subjects, but make them useful to the public, either in the land or sea service. And this was in the business interest of the capitalist class. So it was in a national interest, but it was also in the interest of the class that had emerged through colonialism and liberalism. Like for formerly, or like a middle class that became so rich, they had to distinguish themselves. They sought to distinguish themselves with purchasing art. It was also in their interest that there would be people to secure their wealth by being soldiers, sailors, servants, maids, or laborers. So to them, the higher mortality rates were alarming out of their own interest, which is their business interest, but also the national interest. And when the hospital was built after it had received the royal charter, it had to be made attractive, or it was decided to make it attractive. It didn't have to be that way, but it was to wealthy donors. So in the building of the hospital, there was included a picture gallery, making it kind of Britain's first gallery of contemporary art, because before art was not publicly shown, and the kind of picture gallery in the Fountain House was somehow semi-public before it was shown in aristocrats' homes to other people of the same class. So artists of the time donated their works to the hospital's collection because they were interested in making connections with the influential governors of the hospital, rich people who they hoped could become their patrons or commission them to paint their portrait, for instance. So again, I'm interested in how art then becomes where these wealthy people can meet, experience refined entertainment, feel charitable by giving to the poor, while acting in their enlightened self-interest. And at the center of the 30-minute video work are 5 performers in color-blocked costumes designed by Jay Matthews. And the performers are Laurie Young, Machosi Kabi, Olympia Bukakis, Lera Marodevich, Lauren John Joseph. And the performers recite texts in the work from the 18th century British philosophy and theology surrounding these first public exhibitions, as well as from the minute books chronicling the concrete decision-making processes that lay behind them. So examples of these texts would be a treatise on Asian painting by Church Turnbull from 1740. It would be texts by David Hume and Adam Smith. And usually in the work, that's how the texts are introduced with their title and year, and then performed by a performer who engages with the perspective and subverts it, but also engages with forms of implication and these kind of strange legacy positions that exist within institutions that have at their core these imaginings of superiority and supremacy. And during the research, I noticed in these sources, especially the philosophical and theological sources, an emphasis on compassion, a sentiment consider to morally ennoble those capable of feeling it. And also, like in Adam Smith's A Theory of Moral Sentiments, kind of the idea of compassion is quite interesting, because at a time where there was a lot of misery and violence, the misery of others became kind of reframed, and it became seen not necessarily as a circumstance to be remedied, but as an opportunity to feel superior moral sentiments, to use a term again from Adam Smith. And art played quite a significant role in that constellation. And as it turns out, the compassionate subject becomes interested in kind of like feeling and accessing these emotions and experiencing kind of betterment through feeling compassionate. But as it turns out, in the mid-18th century, the compassionate subject quickly becomes inconvenienced when those inspiring such noble emotions leave their designated position. Inconvenience is complained of by an emergent artistic elite as soon as the rhetorically addressed public actually shows up to the exhibitions and expresses an opinion. So from the Foundling Hospital, the same group of artists then wanted to exhibit more broadly, more widely to kind of a rhetorical public seeking fame and recognition. And that happened in central London, in the Strand. And again, that's another part of the work that goes into more entanglements with liberal and colonial projects that art's becoming public was immersed in. And what I find particularly interesting in these kind of first instances of art going public and addressing a public in that sense is that, contrary to widespread assumption that fine art is simply not of interest to all social classes, which we often encounter to this day, it becomes evident when looking at these first exhibitions, these first public exhibitions, that initially they existed, in fact, a strong interest across classes, and that was nothing that was doubted, like from the first exhibition on, even if entrance was free. Subgroups were built to discuss how to keep people out who would misbehave, but it was clear that everyone would be interested, it would be a spectacle, and people would be interested in coming. And during the first exhibitions, this did happen. A whole relatively wide range of people came, despite the inclusions of certain professions from the beginning on, or women with children, etc. But the interest was there, but concrete measures were taken to restrict access and keep the poor away from art. At the same time, as knowledge about art was becoming established as social currency, and I think that's interesting when looking at David Hume, for instance. There's a performance parts or a collage of Hume's text of the Standard of Taste, in which I think some of the contradictions, or the ostensible contradictions, they're not contradictions at all, of European and the Scottish Enlightenment become quite evident in having to claim that taste, for instance, is universal. It needs to apply to everyone on the entire globe. But at the same time, as its principles apply to everyone, only some can set the standard. And so the principle needs to be for everybody, but then we need to elevate a certain elite who's knowledgeable enough, who has had the chance to compare beautiful objects, to then develop a fine taste, to then kind of set the standard of taste. And I think that's what happens around that time when, first of all, it is said that you have to be exposed to beautiful things and compare them and know a lot about them in order to be tasteful and judge any work of art, as the poor were kept away from it. And it is closely connected to colonial violence and as well, if not foundationally so. So the work reconstructs these entanglements and, for example, also reconstructs how, after the first exhibition, artists from that group invented the exhibition entry fee to explicitly shut out those who, in their eyes, lacked the ability to judge art. And in their preface to their accompanying catalogs, they go into detail justifying why they had to establish an entry fee to keep out those who couldn't judge or purchase work, although they were still addressing them rhetorically as like an everyone. And to me, it's interesting how these things are normalized, how exhibition entry and high exhibition entry is normalized, how, for instance, Tate Britain can advertise on big banners free for all, and then if someone actually took it seriously and went to the counter, that it would experience that many of the exhibitions are not free at all, but cost £20. So a lot of things that were kind of like presented as universal or are today normalized, I'm looking at when they became constructed in a really local and petty and messy way by looking at these minutes and having performers, working with performers who it was a great pleasure to talk to and discuss these ideas with, who brought in their personalities to engage with these complications and subvert them, and also find themselves in these split positions where they're all established in their respective practices, but feel kind of implicated and subversive to these violent structures at the same time. And that was something that we're interested in, also to ask the questions if by stressing these implications and forms of implicatedness of art, and by not assuming that art is per se critical, for instance, if this could also be grounds to actually ask the question how different institutions can be built that do not have these assumptions at their core that were forming or casting the core of these same, not only institutions, but these notions of taste and beauty and art from kind of a European colonial and reality that was oppressive of poor people and working class people, and to also think about the ways in which artists' self-conceptions are quite deeply enmeshed in these forms of violence and institutionalized exclusions. Okay, I think I'll